Hello everybody, welcome to my talk. Today we're going to talk about Azure App Service and how this is the best place to host your .NET apps. My name is Byron Tardif. I'm a Senior Program Manager with the Azure App Services team. And I've been in this team pretty much since the beginning. So I've worked on anything that has to do from deploying the service into the cloud, monitoring of the service, monitoring of the applications that are hosted on the service. And most recently, I've been working mostly on the UI of App Service, everything that has to do with the Azure portal. A few pointers that I want to give you from the start is we have the Azure team blog, which is a blog that is written by the people that are actually working on Azure App Service, and you can see it there. I usually post monthly, and I give you an update of what is the latest, greatest things that come out from the platform in the UI. Then you have my Twitter handle. I usually answer questions. Anything that you run into, you can always reach out to me on Twitter. And if I don't know the answer, I usually know the person that does. And that's one of the ways of getting a hold of us. And then finally, that's my email address. That's my actual email address. Emails come to me. And I also try to answer emails, questions that come over email. And if I don't know the answer, I usually redirect you to either a post, a forum, or anything like that. So let's get started with the content of this talk. And the main focus here is to first get you situated on Azure. Azure has a plethora of services. There's over 70 of them. And one of the family of services is this thing called Azure App Service. Azure App Service is a platform as a service offering. So when you're talking about the cloud, there's usually three different big families that the services are divided into. One is IaaS, or infrastructure as a service. And this is the more traditional way of thinking about, I have a VM that sits under my desk. Well, now I have a VM that is sitting in the cloud. And we have this analogy of comparing your application, the way that it's hosted, to the different ways in which you can get a car today. If you're on infrastructure as a service, this would be the equivalent of you buying a car and also being in charge of the maintenance of that car. So to bring the analogy to the VM, you're in charge of managing the OS upgrades. You're in charge of making sure availability is there. You need to run multiple instances to achieve that. You need to handle upgrade domains. You need to patch whenever there's a security vulnerability that gets revealed. You need to make sure that all of your dependencies are patched, etc. And that is a lot of work. Then comes platform as a service, which is kind of an evolution in the direction of you having to do less work and you focusing more on your code rather than on the platform. Azure App Service is a platform as a service offering, and what we do is we have the expertise and we know how to basically give you an image of the OS that is always up to par as far as security goes. It has all of the stuff that you need, and we also monitor and ensure that there's availability for you. It also makes it very easy to scale. Basically, we're going to see it in one of the demos. It's as easy as dragging a slider. And then the other end of the spectrum is software as a service, in which case you stop worrying about the code and you just basically are renting a service. You're renting a car, right? You're getting an Uber to come and pick you up. So in App Service, we believe that the platform as a service is that little it's right in the right spot between control and access to your code, and letting you have that control that you need without having to worry about the control that you don't need. Let's take a zoom into App Service. App Service, as I said, is a family of products, and we have these four products in context. One of them is what we call web apps. This covers web applications, API apps, and also the mobile backend product that we have, and it just basically gobble it up into this web apps category. The next one is App Service environments in the bottom right. And that is basically the ability we give you to create a standalone dedicated app service hosting environment where all of the infrastructure is dedicated to you. In the traditional web apps model, you're basically running on shared infrastructure. Even though you get your own dedicated VM, there's still a bunch of infrastructure that is shared by all of the other tenants that are using the service. So one of the things that App Service Environments gives you is that ability to basically have your own VNet. You can configure that VNet whichever way you want. You can set up firewalls, you can do advanced networking stuff to connect on-premise, etc. And it also gives you the ability to have much larger scale. On a traditional web app, you usually go to large instances and up to 20 individual instances. On app service environments, you can go all the way up to 50 extra larges. And then if you feel like you need more than that, we can always open a support request and we can lift that cap. The next thing that I want to talk about is web app for containers. And this is basically the Linux family of offerings that we have in App Service. This was something that was announced last week as a GA product. And it basically gives you the ability to have that similar traditional web app feel that you might already be used to, but now hosted on a Linux machine. And that is for the basically scenarios where you want to deploy your own code. And the other scenario is when you want to deploy a Docker container, where you basically all you care about is we provide the platform that has all of those features and functionality that you're already familiar with, including high availability, fast scale out operations, but you don't want to think about deploying your code, you want to think about deploying your container. And then finally, in the bottom left, we have Azure Functions, which is our entry into the basically serverless paradigm, where you basically are writing code that is very atomic, and it can scale a lot. Like this is, you don't care that much about the scale, you don't set the scale, but all you care about is there is something that will execute your code whenever a transaction comes in, whenever there's an event. So it's an event-driven way of writing your code. For this particular presentation, I'm going to focus on the top two, so web apps and web apps for containers. And this is basically an overview of what I already talked about, the two differences in the Linux model that we have. One is the more traditional, I want to deploy my code, I want to deploy the project that I'm already familiar with and use all of the app service infrastructure that I already know how to use. And the second one is how do I deploy a container and how do I have a platform as a service offering that lets me just throw a container in and still have all of the flexibilities of the platform as a service. And this is a slide that I always enjoy talking about because it's what we call one of our feel-good slides, where you get an idea of how big App Service is. App Service is one of the three largest services on Azure. And this is also a slide that happens to be out of date pretty much every other week. Right now, I know that our total requests per day is over 19 billion hits. So this gives you an idea of the adoption and how fast the platform is growing. And there's a reason for that, right? And then this is a summary. It's an incomplete summary of all of the features that we have that are built into the platform. I like showing this slide because it gives you an idea of each one of these line items. You might not use all of them for your particular solution, but each one of these line items would be a line item that you would have to code and battle test and harden yourself. And what the platform as a service gives you is the ability to say, hey, I need this particular thing, I need this particular thing. It usually becomes a turnkey where you just say, enable this feature, and you get to take advantage of those features and all of the hardening that we've done from running the service for over 5 years now towards production ready, and you have confidence and you just basically use it and it just works. And that is something that is very magical when you think about it. It's just one more piece that you don't have to worry about and you can focus on specifically your code. And during these demos, these are the ones that are highlighted in red are the features that I'm going to be showing. So even though we're going to spend about an hour here going through App Service and the stuff that it does for .NET developers, I'm only just scratching the surface. So this is just to set it in context and get an idea of what are the things that we're going to see. Okay, so let's dive into the demos. The first thing that I would like to show you is this is what the Azure portal looks like. If you've never seen it, this is basically the place where you're going to be spending the time managing, creating resources, and doing configuration type of activities. To get started, all you need to do is you need to go to this plus sign, and that is basically the create new. Everything in Azure, we call it as a resource and we model it as a resource. So in this case, you're going to create a new resource. We're going to get started and we're just going to create a web application. And the reason why I'm doing this is I want to show you how easy it is to get started and have that first resource that you've ever created in Azure. So for this case, I'm just going to give it a name. You're going to see that you need to have an Azure subscription. In this case, I'm choosing what subscription I'm going to put it in. Then this concept of resource group, that if you're new to Azure, this is going to be a new concept for you. The way to think about a resource group is think of it as a folder. It is basically a place where you can group elements of your application together. Things that belong together should be together. And you can also use it to set role-based access control on those resources from a management perspective. So what that means is if I want to have Bob be the operator of my application, I can give him read access at the resource group level, and he should be able to see all of the monitoring alerts or monitoring metrics for my application. If I want Susan to be the owner of the application, then I can give her contributor access at the resource group level, and then anything that's under there, she will have read-write access to that. So it allows you to have that separation of concerns as to who is doing monitoring, who's doing actual publishing and administrative operations on that site. The next thing is the OS family. In this case, as I mentioned, for web apps, you have the option of hosting it on Windows or on Linux. And for this first demo, I'm going to start with Windows. And then comes the app service plan. The app service plan is basically how we abstract your application from the actual hardware where it's going to be running under. So the properties of the app service plan include the name. So I'm just going to call this BK demo. The physical location, so this is going to tell us in what particular data center is going to be hosted. As you know, Azure has a bazillion data centers and a bazillion different regions. In this case, I'm just going to go with South Central US. And then finally, the other thing that I can configure here is the pricing tier. Basically, how big of a machine do I need in terms of small, medium, larges? And you can go all the way down to free. And this basically gives you a site that you can run, and there's some quotas in it. So, after, if you're putting a lot of traffic in it, it will get stopped. So it's something that you want to do for development purposes. For production purposes, we want to make sure that you're at least on a standard. So that's what I'm going to pick today. This is just a small single core 1.75 GBs of RAM, and that's enough to get me started, right? So at this point, I've clicked create, and behind the scenes, we're going to go and we're going to provision that application. And when this is done, you're going to have an empty web application that is ready for you to go and publish some code. This is going to take a couple seconds, and while this is going on, one of the things that I usually talk about is the things that you can do with the portal. As I mentioned, I work on the portal on a day-to-day basis, so there's a couple tricks that I usually like to show. One is, if you don't like this blue theme, you can always double-click on the background and switch it around. If you work on night, this dark theme is going to be super useful. For now, I'm going to just keep it on the standard one. And if you notice, while I was talking, we got that notification that, hey, my resource just got created. So now, where do I go from here? I can go to the resource. And this is basically the management view of that new application that I just created. And as I mentioned, if you look at the left, we have this huge list of features that you can just basically go and enable for your web app. And I'm going to touch on a few. If you're following at home and you're more of a instruction-based learner, You can do exactly what I'm going to do right now if you follow our quick start guide. If you see when you create a new empty web app, the first thing that you will get is this notification that there's, hey, this is how you get started. And we give you a very straightforward guide for a couple different scenarios, depending on what programming language you're using. And so if you want to try this a little bit later, you don't need to watch the video again. You can just basically go create your web app and then follow the instructions for whatever scenario seems interesting to you. Right now, I'm going to switch over to the tool that most developers use, in this case, Visual Studio. And the whole point of this talk is not showing you my fancy coding skills. I'm sure most of you guys out there can write better code than I do. But it's showing you some of the platform features that gives you that ability to focus on that code and just basically leverage the platform features that are there for you. So during most of this presentation, what I'm going to be using is the boilerplate ASP.NET Core MVC web application that you can just create by going File, New, ASP.NET Core application, and create a new project from there. So if you want to follow at home, that's what you would do. So I already have this boilerplate app, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to leverage some of the built-in tools for Visual Studio to go and publish this application. So first of all, let's see it running, make sure that I didn't do any dumb coding mistakes. And what this is going to do is basically going to compile the code, it's going to download all of the dependencies, make sure that everything is working, and then it's going to run the app locally. So if we give it a couple seconds, it should come right up. And there we have it. This should be no surprise to anybody. This is the ASP.NET boilerplate code, and it's at this point running locally. If we go over to the Azure app that I just created, I can see what's in there by clicking this browse or clicking over here in the URL for the site. And as you can see, we're going to get this empty web app experience. This is a segue for another very good learning resource that we have. There is a Microsoft Virtual Academy course that is linked right here in the empty web app page. This is about 4 hours worth of content that you can spend with the actual people. This is all of the program managers that are working on the product, and we talk about our different areas of expertise. So if you want to get a deep dive onto app service, this is a good place to start. You just create an empty web app, and boom, you have the 4 hours of free training that you can go over to get a very good overview of what the service is and how you can use it, and a good idea of all of the features that are there. So now, let's go through and publish this empty application, or this very simple application, into my web app. So if you've ever used other different offerings in Azure, or maybe you gave it a try a couple of years ago and you're now coming back to it, one of the things that was a pain point was having to wait 20 minutes for the VM to boot. And this is pretty much true of any infrastructure as a service offering. Where you need to wait for the OS to get specialized and do all of that stuff, and then have your code deployed into it. But what I'm going to do right now is basically, because we have all of this built-in tooling into Visual Studio, I can very easily just go and say, hey, I'm going to point it to that application that I just created, which is BK Demo 101, and I'm going to click OK. What this is going to do is it's going to get all of my code ready, and it's going to push it into that web app, and we're going to see about 20 to 30 seconds later, all of my code is already deployed into that application. So let's go check it out over here. I'm going to click Browse. And this is one of the things that we see when we do a deployment. This is something that we want to avoid in production. We want to make sure that the people are not coming to the app when you're in the middle of doing a deployment, right? So one of the things that I'm going to show you is how to avoid this. It looks like the deployment is still going. There we go. Now it's complete. And we should have a working web app in a few seconds here. let's go take a look at what's going on over here while this is happening. So a good thing that you can see is that you get a lot of the metrics and a lot of the information about the health of your application really upfront. But you don't want to be coming into this application every time that you want to check what you're doing. And one of the really powerful features that the Azure portal gives you is the ability to create a dashboard of interesting metrics. So for example, if I wanted to see the errors that my application was throwing, I can always pin this to the dashboard. And now I have a cool way to see whenever there's errors in my application just from the Azure dashboard. And you can obviously go throw this into a big monitor, you can resize it, and you can do fancy stuff like that. At this point, my application should have finished deploying. It's there, it's running. When I hit it again, it comes back and it does it fast. So obviously when you're developing, doing this type of F12 publishing operation is fine. But when you're talking about a production workload, you want to avoid those, hey, I just deployed code to the production slot and everything is slow because it's warming up, or I'm in the middle of a deployment and there's traffic coming in, or I deployed something and I just realized that I deployed a bug to production, which is no good, and there's no easy way for you to go back. So that's where we're going to look at another set of features that include what we call deployment slots and CI/CD integration. So if we go to the slides, now we're in this second demo, which is the continuous integration, continuous deployment, and DevOps scenario for app service. And this is a little bit of what we're going to be looking at in this slide, where I'm going to be writing some code, developing in whatever environment I'm familiar with. I'm going to be checking in some code into a code repository. It could be TFS, GitHub, Bitbucket, whatever you're comfortable with or whatever your organization is using. There's going to be some sort of a build process. Then what you want to do is you want to put those bits in a staging environment. The reason you do that is that you can do that last mile verification, last mile validation on the actual hardware and with the production configuration. And that is very valuable. That is the thing, because as a developer, you've seen this before, where it works on my machine. The moment you move it to production, for some reason, something is broken. So having that ability to have that safety net of getting that last mile validation is very useful. You do the validation, and then you have this publishing operation, which is basically how you promote it into production. Okay, I'm getting a couple questions, but I'll come back to those in a second. Once you do that, but you want to do that publishing operation without having to redeploy your code. If you redeploy your code, then you have risks of maybe a package didn't get rehydrated, or there's a cold start, or there's basically a condition that is going to cause a slowness or unavailability on the production side. So you want to do it in a way that you're not actually deploying the code. And that is one of the tricks that we can do with deployment slots. Finally, you have it running in the cloud, and then you have the ability to monitor it, and you basically go in a cycle. You find bugs, you identify problems, and then basically come back to deploying and doing your code again. So let's see this in action. I'm going to switch back over here to Visual Studio. And we can see here that I have already a diff sitting there in my GitHub repo. I'm going to open Visual Studio again. And while that's opening, I'm going to come back to my app. And at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pretend this is a cooking show. I'm going to switch over to my other dashboard, and I already have an application that I had prepared ahead of time. And when we look at this application, what I have is I basically have production that is an empty web app today. Then I have this deployment slots feature, and what I have is I have already created a deployment slot that I call stage. Creating a deployment slot is really easy. All you need to do is you need to click over here, add a slot, and you provide a name, and you give it the option to clone the configuration of your existing app if that's what you want to do. The operation takes 30 seconds and is pretty much painless. So at this point, when I have this deployment slot or staging slot, what I have is I have another version of my app that is running on exactly the same app service plan. So they're sharing resources. That's something important to note, because you don't want to do a stressed run against this application. You want to make sure that this is just for last mile validation type of efforts. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go into deployment options, and I'm going to choose source control provider. So if you remember the diagram that I was talking about, the first thing is you have some code, you check it in, and then you deploy it. So in this case, I have my code deployed to GitHub. If this is the first time that you're doing this, you will have to go through an authentication workflow. I've set up this a couple times before, so my credentials are already there. If you have multiple organizations, you get to choose what organization you want to pull the repos from, and then you get to choose a project. In this case, I'm doing my Hello Web demo. And then one of the interesting things that you can do is, if this was a test environment, we have a way for you to automatically chain in a load test. But because this is the equivalent of my production site, I'm not going to configure that right now. But you could basically have performance tests run every time that you do a commit or a check-in into your repository. And that is a good way to catch performance regressions, because you have that history of, this check-in from this date caused a regression of 10%, and this check-in from this date fixed it. Right, so performance is something that you want to be always on top of. If you're trying to fix performance when you're ready to go to production, that's probably too late to do that. So this gets you into that best practice of checking that continuously as you deploy the application. So I'm going to click OK. And what this is going to do is it's basically going to say to this staging slot, hey, you're going to have to pull your the code that's coming from GitHub, and it's going to go and talk to GitHub and basically register a webhook that GitHub is going to call every time that it discovers there's deployment going on. If I click over here, it's going to take maybe a minute or two, but basically what it's doing is it's downloading that latest version of whatever is checked into my code, and it's getting it ready into this staging slot. While this is going on, because it's going to take a minute or two, I'm going to talk about some of the other features that are very convenient for .NET developers on App Service. And if you go over here to application settings, there's a couple of things to look at. One thing is App Service lets you, target the latest .NET 4.7 or .NET 3.5 or ASP.NET Core or .NET Core 1, 1.1, 2.0. But you can always go all the way back to classic ASP.NET. So if you have any legacy applications, they can still be hosted on App Service. The next thing that I want to give attention to is this remote debugging functionality. So remote debugging functionality lets you attach the Visual Studio Debugger into your production code. So this is literally attaching the debugger to something running on the cloud. It's obviously not something that you want to do on your production site, but because we have the staging slots, then you still have that ability of having exactly the same code between production and your staging slot, running on exactly the same hardware, and you can basically attach the debugger, not stop production, and repro that issue that only happens in that environment for whatever reason. Okay, I think that should be enough. Let's go back to deployment options. My deployment is still going on, so I have time to talk about one more thing. One of the things that I mentioned is that ability to scale your application very easily. So if you look for scale, one of the things that you can see is that you can do the scale up, which is the equivalent of give me a bigger box. So give me a machine that has one CPU to give me a machine that has 2 or 4, but that will only take you so far. But if your application is stateless, one of the things that you can do is you can actually increase the number of instances in which your app is running. So if I drag this over here and I click save, at that point, your application will be started on 9 different instances. You don't need to wait for the VMs to warm up or anything like that. It's just basically how fast it takes for your code to be up and running. That's how fast your app can scale. So let me go back, check if the deployment is done. Okay, it looks like this is still going. Looks like we're being a little bit slow today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this running, and I'm going to start another demo, and then we'll come back to this one in a second. Okay, so what we saw today was this workflow basically of your code getting checked in, built, deployed to a staging slot, and eventually swapped into production on a Windows machine. And that is great if you're a .NET developer that is working on Windows, but one of the things that we're seeing is there's a lot more cross-platform development. And what I'm going to do in the next demo is I'm going to grab exactly the same code that I was running on a Windows machine, and now I'm going to deploy it into a Linux-based web app. So while this is still running, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to remind you how we're doing the create, right? So we go to create new web app, and then the only difference at this point is that I would be selecting Linux and I would be creating a Linux app service plan. As you can see, we have this should look very familiar to what I just demoed before, and we have the same different options of different sizes for your Linux machine. I've already gone forward and created this Linux machine, this Linux web app that I can browse to, and it's going to show you that empty web app experience. I have also already created a staging slot, and in this case, for this one, I have already configured it to pull my changes from GitHub. So in a second, we should be able to see that. Let's browse to the site. So as you can see, this is the production site that has the empty code, and this has the staging version of it, which is just basically the boilerplate code for ASP.NET Core. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio Code, which is what most people would be using on Linux, and I'm going to show you how to get started in this case. So one of the things that you can do here is Visual Studio Code has this integrated terminal, which I love, and you can do something like check for directories. I already created this demo directory, and the code that I have here is pretty much the equivalent of you doing .NET new MVC project. And if you want to follow at home, that's basically what I did to get started. And then I'm going to switch over to my demo directory, and you can see here that I have basically the ASP.NET boilerplate code, and I have this hello.NET Conf, and let's do an H2 over here, and this is web app on Linux demo. So we're going to see that I have my changes are there. Oops, sorry. My changes are there, and I'm going to get this ready to push it. So I have a commit ready to go. Let's switch back over to this so that we can see it in action. And I'm going to go back to deployment options. Remember, at this point, I'm in the staging slot for my Linux app. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a commit and a push into my code repository. the staging site is going to find those changes and basically pull it in and do the deployment. So let's get that started. So I push my changes into my master branch. Basically, the code gets copied from my machine into GitHub. GitHub then turns around and is going to trigger that webhook that goes and talks into the app service deployment infrastructure. And for those of you guys that are new to the platform and not familiar, that's something called Project Kudu. So if you look for Kudu, you can go take a look at advanced tools. And there's a bunch of interesting and fun functionality that comes in here. But this is basically the infrastructure that lets you do all of those CI/CD, and it also supports site extensions and a bunch of other extensibility points for your application. So while I'm waiting for my Kudu code, my Linux code to deploy, because it's still going, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna check back on that Windows-based demo that I was doing before. Make sure that everything went through. So I need to go to the staging slot. I need to go check on deployment options. At this point, my code has made it all the way into the staging slot. I can browse to it. Whoops. Looks like I'm having trouble with this one, or either picked up a cached version. So let's give it a sec. Looks like it's thinking. It's probably going through a cold start. And while that's happening, then what I'm going to start is I'm going to start the swap workflow. So the swap workflow is that functionality that lets you push your code from the staging environment into production without having to do a deployment, right? That is the magic of it. So in this case, I'm going to push my code from stage into production and just click OK. Actually, no, I'm going to wait for it. There. I have the changes that I had in my deployment slot. So now I can swap. Swap is going to take a couple seconds. I'm going to go back to my production site. So this is production, this is staging slot. And in a couple seconds, I'm going to have, now I have what I had in my staging slot. And my staging slot, very important to notice, is I have production. So what this lets you do is, if you're ever in trouble, you deploy something into stage, you validate, you move it to production, and then all of a sudden you discover that in production this is causing some other type of issue that you didn't catch in your validation. You can always swap back, and that is like a very important safety net to have. Moving forward, if you do an additional check-in, that would go back into the staging slot, and then you can do that swap back again. So now we saw that working on Windows, so now let's check it out on Linux. So going back to my deployment options, going back to my deployment slot, I'm going to browse to this app. I should be able to see the edits that I made. So this is going through a cold start. There we go. So this is the live demo. If I go back to my production site, I should be able to browse to it, and this still has the empty code or the empty web app. I'm going to trigger the swap. I'm going to swap from production to stage. And once this goes through, give it a couple seconds. Looks like swap is still in progress. Once this goes through, then I'm going to have my production code over here in production where it belongs. Swap still going. So to give you an idea of what swap is doing, swap first of all is going to grab the code that you have in the staging slot. It's going to warm it up, so it's going to send a couple of requests there, make sure your app is running. Then it's going to do a little bit of DNS trickery, where it's going to grab the DNS of the production site, and it's going to start routing new requests coming in into the staging slot once the staging slot is warmed up. Any ongoing long-running operation that is going against production is going to time out after 120 seconds. And then basically at that point, we swap things over. So it basically makes a very gracious way of going from production into staging. New traffic coming in gets routed to the new instance. And basically that way you avoid having to go through that cold start, right? So if you saw it, once I go to production, everything is fast, and I still have everything else in my staging slot if I ever want to swap back. Okay, and the other important thing to note is that all of the features that you're already familiar with are here. So if you want to scale your Linux instance, you're going to notice that it's shockingly similar, right? So all you need to do is you need to drag the slider, and that's it. New instances get added as soon as your code is able to start and execute on that new machine. The machine doesn't need to boot. It's already there, warmed up, waiting for your code. Okay, so we saw this is basically the deployment workflow of you deploying your code into a Linux machine, right? So now the new kid in town is containers. So how do you containerize your application and then run it as a container? And this could be specifically for .NET Core applications running on Linux. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. So here I have another instance of my boilerplate code. There's nothing to it, and I'm sitting in Visual Studio. So this already runs is the simple .NET Core getting started web application. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 2 clicks to basically Dockerize this app. So if you see it, Visual Studio has built-in Docker support. I'm going to choose a Linux container because that's basically what I'm going to be deploying it to. And this is basically going to go and it's going to add all of the other files that you need to make this a Docker app, so a Docker container-based app. It's still .NET Core. There's nothing special that you have to write. You don't need to be a Docker developer to get started with this. When I click Run, what you're going to notice is that instead of saying IS Express or anything like that, it's going to run in a Docker container. And to give you an idea of what's going on while that's building, then I'm going to do Docker images. And what this has done is it's basically downloaded the ASP.NET Core Docker container image that is available for you to basically compose with. And it's basically attached my ASP.NET boilerplate code in a compose manner into that container and created a new container. So what I have now is a composition of the standard Microsoft ASP.NET Core container and my code into a package that I can then now deploy. So this should be running in a second. Whoops. Let me try that again. And while this is going, I'm going to go back to the Azure portal, and I'm going to talk about how do you create a container-based platform as a service application. So if you go here to create new service, one of the options that you're going to see is you're going to see this thing called containers as the category. Web app for containers is right here, and it's going to be very familiar. It should be very familiar where I can do, whoops, looks like my container worked this time. So I can basically name it, same idea. I can select an existing app service plan, so you can actually collocate a Linux web app with an app service for containers app into the same app service plan. And then you can configure the source of your container. Basically, where are you checking in that container image? And as you can see, we have the built-in Azure Container Registry. Or if you have it in Docker Hub, or if you have a private container repository, you can always point us to there. And since this is now running over here, I'm going to go back. And you can see that I have my Docker images and I have my Docker container that is running with the code that I just deployed. And that's basically what we were looking at over here that popped up. So same code, very familiar, nothing to it, right? Well, let's go take a look at the container app that I have already created. And if I browse to it, you're going to see exactly the same code. Very boring, I know. But interesting enough, you have all of those app service features that you're already familiar with. So you can basically scale out a container-based application by just dragging the slider, and now you have 6 machines running that container at scale. Right? No need to configure load balancing. We take care of all of that for you. If one of the machines get into a bad state, we basically recover that for you. We give you a new machine, and you basically continue to have those 6 instances as needed. That is the beauty of Platform as a Service. So now, let's see that CI/CD workflow working. In this case, I haven't created a staging slot. I'm going to go do a Docker push instead, straight into production. I'm living dangerously. So I have my little cheat sheet over here. So as you can see, I have this hello Docker, which is basically the image that gets composed, the combination of the ASP.NET Container app and my code. And what I'm going to do is I have this thing because I don't want to fat thumb one of the commands. And what I'm doing here is I have already logged into my ACR instance on Azure. So basically all I'm going to do is I'm going to add a tag that says, the hello Docker latest, which is this image right here. I'm going to tag it as my ACR hello Docker latest image. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to push that code into my ACR container instance, right? So here we see the composing operation going on, new bits getting pushed out, and what I should have over here is that container-based app running. So now let's go do one of those audacious code edits that I'm famous for, and I'm going to remove all of this boilerplate code. And I'm going to say h1, this is a Docker demo on app service. Save my changes, build this. And while this is going on, I'm going to start addressing some of the questions that came in. So Adam Wilson says, what is the relationship between app service plans, instances, and deployments? Is the pricing number in the plan per instance, per deployment, or per plan? Okay, so the app service plan has some properties. So that is the size of the VM, small, medium, large, the SKU, free, standard, basic, and how many instances you're running. So the price that you see is basically the price per instance. So if you have one small app service plan, you're paying that price. If you have one small app service plan that has 2 instances, you need to multiply that by 2. Let me go back over here. Whoops, get this done. So I'm going to retag the latest one, and I'm going to do another Docker push. While those things are getting ready, I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to check production, give it a couple seconds for code to make it there, and then in the meantime, I'm going to answer another question. When you scale up, are those instances started in the same VM, or do they distribute across various VMs? This is from Arif Yayalar. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it right. So Yarif, what happens is here, you get a new VM. So each instance of an app service plan is basically a completely new machine for you. Obviously, underneath the covers, everything is there's chances are that it could be on the same physical machine, but because of the way that VMs are isolated, you're still getting a dedicated 4 CPUs and whatever amount of memory you're reserving in the small, medium, large instance. Another question from Arif is, when you scale out, does it scale out to 9 instances of S1 or 9 app instances on the same S1 instance? No, when you scale out, you're literally giving it new machines. So you go from running on one VM with one core, a certain amount of CPU, to 2 or 3 or 4 VMs, each one of them with their dedicated resources. So I'm gonna hit refresh over here. And by this time, my code's made it, and I basically done a Docker push straight into production using CI/CD between Azure Container Registry and Azure App Service on Docker. Okay, another question, Alex Mens. Can you use a staging slot on a shared Azure app plan? I'm not sure what that question means, but if you're talking about the shared SKU, no, staging slots we consider them to be a production feature. So they're only on what we consider to be production app service plans. So I think basic, standard, and above have the feature of staging slots. Any other questions? Okay, so I'm gonna switch back to my slides and basically wrap this thing up. So when we talk about who's using Azure App Service today, this is a small list of the people that we have, and I have some very specific scenarios where we think that Azure App Service is a great fit. If you're doing digital marketing, if you're doing transactional-based applications, or if you're doing line of business applications, I think App Service has all the features that you need, and we have you covered. Here are some examples of what customers are doing. In this case, this is a company that basically cut down their deployment development lifecycle from being at 2 weeks, basically from the point that they cut a build that they were considered to be production ready, to now they can do that in 5 minutes. So 5 minutes from saying my build is ready for production, going into production versus 2 weeks. That gives you an ability, that gives you an idea of the ability of having those agile development life cycles by just cutting time by using platform features. They didn't have to write any fancy code, they just basically used the production features that we have. This is an example of a Swedish microinsurance company where they're doing a transactional application that requires a lot of scale, and they're able to achieve that with App Service. Obviously, this is a line of business type of application where it's maybe active during the day and not active during the night, so they can auto-scale their App Service plan and remove instances as needed during the day. And then finally, Hogarth, that works with Dyson. So every time that Dyson has a product launch, you can imagine it's a website that gets millions and millions of requests per second. And they basically have handled all of the recent launches for the new Dyson vacuums. This is the brand that is recognizable worldwide, that generates a lot of traffic, and they can basically survive that by hosting it on App Service and taking advantage of the platform features to get that scalability and ability to run their app at scale massively across the world by leveraging the platform features and not having to write all of that code themselves. Okay. With that, I want to leave you with a couple final thoughts. If you want to get started with App Service, you can go to aka.ms/try app service. You can get started without a credit card. We give you a sandbox that you can use for a couple of hours, deploy some of the code that you already have, see it running, and then if you think that's cool, then you can basically open a free trial that gives you a couple credits that you can use the full Azure experience for a couple of months. If you're a Microsoft Premier customer, we also have this Fast Start program that gets you on-site training and gets you started using Azure very fast with very knowledgeable people that will help you along the way. And then finally, remind you, we have the App Service team blog where you can get the latest, greatest stuff from there. You can reach me on Twitter. I tweet about 3 or 4 different things. I tweet about beer, I tweet about science fiction novels, and I tweet about App Service. And I'll answer your questions if you ask them. And then finally, my email. This is my real email. I actually do get questions here, and if I don't know the answer, the guy that knows the answer is usually sitting next to me. So feel free to reach out, and we're always happy to hear about you. and what you're doing with .NET and App Service. So having said that, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.